Here There Be Tigers is a magnificent short story written by Ray Bradbury in 1951 that deals with a rocket expedition sent to a planet to see whether or not its natural resources can be harvested for the human race. They discover a paradise which seems to provide for them whatever they desire, even as they think of it. Yeah, that never turns out well in fiction, does it? Or if somebody tries to hide it from somebody else. And of course, at this point, you're wondering, well, this is wonderful, but why are we talking about this and why aren't we on a router right now? Well, Here There Be Tigers will definitely not be on your exam. But my friends, let me show you something right here, because right here at the bottom of your config, here there be exam points. And I mean a lot of them. There's a lot going on in this little section of your config. We've looked at a little of this earlier in the course. We're going to review one or two important concepts as far as connecting to the router goes. Also on the board, I think I mentioned switch in this chapter a couple times. We're going to stick on a router because I want to throw in a little bonus lab for you here at the end. Now, the exec timeout and logging synchronous commands, those are commands that I always put on a router before I start a lab. And in this section, near the end, you'll see why. But we're going to concentrate on the connections and the passwords first, because those are huge. They're not complex, but there are some details, especially when it comes to that VTY connection, that we don't want to overlook, because that's going to allow us to snag extra points on exam day. So let's go ahead and head back here to the board for just a moment. And actually, we already did the config mode. Sorry about that. Let's go ahead and bring up our router window. Now, what I'm about to say is probably a little more true of a router than a switch, because a lot of times, especially in a smaller network, you can pull a switch out. You can almost just slap a switch into your network, picks up the VTP information, picks up the VLAN information, you go to town, and you're ready to go. But with a router, some features that you do want to use are not going to be enabled, and some features that we don't want to have running will be running by default. And of course, this makes perfect sense because as good as Cisco is, and as advanced as routers have gotten, there's no way that they know exactly everything that we want in our particular network to be running and not running. Makes perfect sense. So it's up to you and I, as the network admins, to be able to fine-tune our routers and switches, and we've got to know quite a few commands to do that. We're going to use some of those in this section, and then of course others you'll see throughout the rest of the course. I'm going to show you how to configure some basic features that you'll probably want to use as well, but that are not running by default. And we're going to start with the very bottom part of that configuration, the one we just looked at, which also happens to be one of the most important parts of any config, and that's the passwords. Now, when we're looking at that line portion, let's bring that up again. This entire section right here, and I should say this entire little section right here, because there's not much there, this controls who can get into our router and who can't. And I would say that's a pretty important thing, especially in today's world. Now, when we connect to a Cisco switch, of course, we can do so either physically or logically. I went over the physical connections in the cable section. I want to go over them again here briefly because there are some important details there. And since it ties in with passwords, this is a good time to repeat them. We can also logically connect from a remote location via Telnet or SSH. And of course, that remote location can just be one router to another in the same network, because that's what we're going to do. It doesn't have to be, hey, I'm in Los Angeles and I got a Telnet to New York or SSH to Hong Kong to look at a router. It doesn't work that way. I may use it to just look at a router in the same network. Now let's talk about that physical connection first. And again, to physically connect our laptop to a Cisco device, we're going to need a rollover cable. Typically, it's a blue cable, a flat blue cable, with an RJ45 connector at one end, looks just almost like a phone jack, and a DB9 connector on the other end. If your rollover cable has a DB9 connector, of course you need an adapter to connect it to your laptop, because your laptop, a modern laptop, is not going to have a DB9 connector. It's not going to have a DB9 port. Another little gotcha to watch out for. We've all been in environments where the routers and switches are in a crowded little area or a crowded little refrigerated box, hopefully slightly cooled. And you can't quite see all the ports and everything that's written over them. It's kind of hard to get to things. Well, when you're connecting to the console port, you got to be really careful about that because there are going to be quite a few ports on a switch, of course, that'll let you put the rollover cable into them, the RJ45 connector, but the connection wouldn't work. Now, most Cisco devices have the console port almost by itself. So once you spot it, there's not a real danger of you putting it in the wrong port. But some older models, including some popular home lab models, the auxiliary port is going to be right next to the console port. So you just have to watch that because you can be trying to reach around and snap that rollover cable in and you feel it going. It's like, oh, okay, I'm all set. And then you realize that you've plugged it into the auxiliary port. So it's not going to harm anything, but it's also not going to work. Now, for your exam, frankly, I would memorize the following values, the ones I've got on the screen here for your terminal emulator program. Doesn't matter, use HyperTerminal, something else. It doesn't matter which one you use. They've all got pluses and minuses. And you should, though, be ready to recite these settings with your emulator. 9600 bits per second, 8 data bits, no parity, 1 stop bit, no flow control. Because most terminal emulators, when they open up, they're going to ask you for this information. They're all going to need this information, but they'll either not have a default setting at all or a default setting that's not going to work for you. Now that we're connected, let's get back to those passwords. And right now, let's go back to our router. And again, I will talk about the exact timeout and logging synchronous at the appropriate time, but right now let's stick to the passwords. And by default, we have no passwords on our router or switch. Makes perfect sense. We don't even want defaults because, of course, if Cisco made routers with defaults, they'd have to set them all to the same thing, and then we just have people forgetting to change them, and then it's just downhill from there. So let's do an exit out of that to go back to the window that tells us, hey, console 0 is now available. Press return to get started. Okay, I can do that. Okay, no password check at all, and I'm back in user exec, and then I type enable as one word to get into enable mode or privilege exec mode, and there we are. So far so good, but do we want that? Because that means that anybody with a laptop and a rollover cable can connect successfully to our device, switch or router. That's a default we're likely going to want to change. Now there's a little bit of built-in security here because, why? Because I got to be there. You've got to be there. You can't roll a rollover cable from a router 200 miles away to your house and plug it in. Believe me, they don't come that long. And that is a little bit of built-in security that the person who's going into your router via the console port has to physically be there. But still, maybe we just want to put a password on all of them so that when someone comes in to work on them, we just don't want them in any device that we haven't told them what the password is. So it's a default that we'd like to change. So it's the line con 0 that we need to be concerned with. And that's another thing with the exam. You just want to be very clear which port does which down here. You want to be able to look at a list of passwords here and say, okay, if someone was telnetting in or SSHing in, here's the password they would need. If they were connecting physically, here's the password they need. And I'm about to make sure that that is all crystal clear for you. We need 2 passwords on the console line. The password command, which is the one everybody remembers, and the login command, which tends to get left off. Again, it does not matter in which order you put them on any of these lines as long as you use them both. And we'll go ahead and put in a password of CCENT for the console port access. Again, we got to go into global config mode first. Line con 0. And that's it. Now, a word to the wise on passwords. And this is a great time for me to tell you, since you're really at the beginning of your Cisco studies, people worry about, is this command case sensitive, is this command case sensitive, is this password case sensitive, etc. If you choose a case for your passwords now, whether it be uppercase or lowercase, you never have to worry about any password commands being case sensitive. You see what I'm saying? Especially for your lab practice. I know at work, they may have standards in place to say, we put all our passwords in uppercase or what have you. But for your lab work, choose whichever one you're comfortable with, whether it's lowercase or uppercase, and stick with it for the rest of your life. And you never have to worry about whether a certain password command is case sensitive or not. That's something that will come in handy, especially in your later studies, especially if you go after the CCIE, which I hope you'll choose to do. It's certainly a noble encounter, but people do get super paranoid when they're going after the IE about every command, but especially anything that could be case sensitive. So again, just pick lowercase or uppercase now, stick with it, and you'll be fine. Now, we have set this password, but of course you know what we've got to do. We've got to verify it. We've got to test it. So I don't see anything different yet. R3con0 is now available. Press return to get started. And here we go. User access verification, and I'm being prompted for a password. I put it in, then I'll type enable, and then I'm good to go. Now you probably noticed something really odd when I put in that password. It didn't appear. We didn't even get asterisks. That's a security feature, because they don't even want anybody behind you or doing a screen capture of some kind to see how many asterisks show up, because then that tells them here's how many characters are in the password. So it's just something we have to be ready for, because you type it in, it's like, why aren't I seeing anything? I always see something. You won't see anything when you're entering a password. So let's see. So we've got that done, and really that's it for the physical connection. That's really it. You don't have a whole lot of options for console. Now for Telnet and SSH, we do. So on the next video, we're going to start with that. We're going to review a fundamental or two about Telnet and SSH, also give you some port numbers for them. And then we're going to do a lab here in our network, and you're going to see some little gotchas with Telnet that are really going to come in handy on the exam for you that you know about. And it's also going to help that you know about them for production network work, because I got caught by one, and I'll be glad to tell you about that and fess up on the next video. I'll see you there.